Week 2 of our 7-week series, 7 Words for a Flourishing Church. Each year leading into our Vision Day, our Budget Day, which is going to be the last Sunday of the month, and we're doing a little part 2 3 weeks later to come back and pray about some of those things. Each year we want to pause and remember that God has called us to be His mission team for such a time as this and in such a place as this. And that's not just those of us on the pastoral team or those called to be missionaries or youth workers or part of the market team. It's all of us. All of us together are to be a witness to the good news in Jesus Christ for such a time and for such a place as this. And so it's good to pause and to think, well, what sort of a church and what sort of people do we need to be? And so this year we're looking at 7 foundational words, 7 key words for a flourishing church. I think I said last week that this is particularly important because it's no longer business as usual. We are no longer in the Christendom world that many of us grew up with, where we knew how to navigate it and we could assume that most people, even if they weren't churchy, at least kind of had a vague sort of kind of respect or an idea for what the good news of Jesus was about. And I put up this graph, which I found deeply disturbing or thought-provoking, which is the census data about from the last 50 or so years.
Back in the 60s, almost everyone in Australia would have called themselves a Christian. They may not have been a churchgoer, they may not have actually understood it, but there was this vague sense that we are Christians in a Christian world, and this is kind of something that's important. Well, in the last 50 years, that's totally fallen away, and so in the 2016 census, just over 50% of people call themselves Christian. And for the first time, 30%, just over 30%, no religion is the largest single group. And that's not people of other religions. That's not the Muslims and the Hindus and the Buddhists and the other groups. These are people who say, I'm not sure there is a God, or I'm not sure we need a God, or I think that humanism will get the job done. That's the largest group, and all the other religions are actually still quite a small group. In other words, we no longer live in what you could call a Christian country. And the thing that, when I keep joining the dots on these graphs, it means that in the next 2 to 5 years, the lines cross over and all the Christians added up together become a smaller group than those who are no religion. And don't forget, when you think about that group called Christians, that's everyone. That includes everyone who ticks the box Christian, who comes to church once every 2 years. Right? Yeah, it doesn't mean everyone who's devout. Matter of fact, that's a very small percentage of that number. And the other scary thing about that number of people who call themselves Christians, it's overwhelmingly the over 60s. It's the 60s and 70s and 80-year-olds around who are still committed to their faith. Overwhelmingly, the 40s and 30s and 20s have no connection with church. And that even includes young adults who technically still believe but see no point in doing the whole church thing that their parents did. Institutions don't work. So we no longer live in a Christian country, and we are in fact a small mission group in a messy, fast-changing, multicultural, multi-belief world. And it's untrusting, and it's anxious, and it's argumentative, and it's gullible, and it's fierce, and you just have to check out the many varieties of fake news on social media, and there's no agreement, and no one's come up with a good alternative for how you do life. And every day the news seems to get more disturbing, and there's arguments about everything from the Middle East to climate change to an interesting assortment of politicians we've got on the world stage at the moment. And there's us. And I'm not all that disturbed, because I think God's people always do their best when they are a small, poor, often persecuted group on the margins. That's when we do best at being salt and light in amongst the empires of the world. And we actually do worse when we are the mainstream and we are aligned with the empire of the day. and we end up being drawn into it. So I'm looking forward and I'm excited for what the Lord's going to do over the next many years. But it's not going to be the same in how we've done it in the past. So our seven words for a flourishing church this year, and I'm sure you may come up with other words that are just as good, is last week we started with the word Christ. It all starts with Jesus at the centre. It's all about Jesus. And today the word is disciple. We are called to be disciples who live out the way of Jesus, who put on the character and practices of Jesus. That's why the men's camp coming up this week. And I have the power to do that just by putting my hand down there. Wow. That's why that camp is so important, because it's all about helping us as men think about how we function as disciples of Jesus. Next week we're looking at the word vision. Do we have a vision for God's mission? Are we outward focused? And then the next week, it's the word love. How do we listen to and build relationships with and empathize with and respond in love to the people around us? That's why we spent the whole of term one. Remember term one, learning how to build relationships, how to listen, and we practiced it in church, because that's the most important thing we can do as we go into the world around us. And then the next word is the word courage. We're going to need courage to step out of our comfort zones to people and strategies different to how we've done things before. And then it's the word lead. How do we show leadership in a world of injustice and inequality and hopelessness? And that day we've got Mark Purser from Baptist World Aid coming to share with us. So it's going to be very interesting. And then our last word, and it's part 2 of our Vision Day, is the word abundance. We need an abundance mindset to be good stewards who with generosity and simplicity and faith look to the Lord to multiply the resources we need. So that's where we're going. Now, second word is the word disciple. We are called to be disciples who live out the way of Jesus, who put on his character and who put on his ways. And if I want to flourish, and if you want to flourish in your faith, the number 2 word is disciple. A total commitment to the way of Jesus. And if we want to flourish as a church, we need to be committed to discipleship. This is day by day by day in all areas of our life, and it's teaching our kids and our grandkids and our new followers to do the same. One of my favourite films of all time, which we still drag out when the Olympics are on, was the film Chariots of Fire. Yeah, classic film now. And it tells the story of Eric Liddell. And Eric Liddell was a devout Christian. He was born to Scottish missionaries in China, and they came back to Scotland to raise their kids. And he grew up and he was very, very, very fast. He was one of the fastest athletes of his day. He was a champion rugby player who played in the national team. He was the superhero of Scotland, basically, back in the early 1920s. But his faith and his commitment to following the ways of Jesus came first. So, for example, for him, that meant you set the Sabbath aside for worship, and there is no sport, no training, no athletic competitions on the Sabbath. And that for him meant the Sunday. Not everyone holds that view, but for him, that was absolutely significant. And so he's on the boat with the rest of the Olympic team to Paris for the 1924 Olympics, and he's entered in the 100 metres sprint, which is still, as it was then, the premier prestigious event to be the fastest man in the world. And he's a favourite for the race. And he's on the boat and he hears people talking, and he discovers that the heats for the 100 metres are on a Sunday. So what does he do? And so he refuses to run in the race, and the film describes how there's this incredible pressure to not let the empire down. This was Britain at its height, the empire that ruled the world, on which the sun never set, and there's pressure from the Prince of Wales and from the British Olympic Association, and he's made to feel incredibly bad if he lets the side down. But he can't do it because his discipleship means there are things you do if you follow Jesus and things you can't do. And if that means dropping out of the Olympics and going back to Scotland in disgrace, so be it. I can't do this. And so in the end, they work out a solution, and one of his mates, who's already won a silver medal in the 400 metres hurdles, lets him take his place in the 400 metre sprint, which is not his best event. And so he runs in that event, and wonder of wonders, he ends up winning gold. And so he returns back to Scotland, back to the UK as a hero. His strong faith in the face of national athletic pride, it makes headlines around the world, and he's got the world at his feet. And yet 12 months later, he gets on a boat and he sails to China, and he spends the next 20 years in obscurity, serving amongst the peasants in the villages of China. I wonder whether you'd do that, to leave it all behind and to go because of a sense of call. And then World War II comes, and the Imperial Japanese Army take over China, and he finds himself in a brutal internment camp, and he's suffering with the other inmates there. And on the 21st of February 1945, just 5 months before liberation, Eric Liddell dies. And another inmate who was in there with him says the entire camp was stunned for days. So great was the vacuum that his death had left. And another missionary who was also in the camp with him said, as he sat with him, his last words were, "It's complete surrender," in reference to how he had given his whole life totally to God. And it says that all of Scotland mourned his death. And Liddell wrote these words: "You will know how much of God, and only as much, you will know as much of God, and only as much of God as you are willing to put into practice." Discipleship is about total surrender to Jesus Christ and putting into practice the ways of Jesus so that your life and my life shines Jesus to others. So what did Jesus say when he commissioned his followers and sent them out? He put it like this, and you can picture them all. This is a few weeks after Jesus was raised from the dead in that very first Easter, and he's called them to meet him at a mountain up in Galilee. So they've had a 3-day road trip, talking together and heading up, and they climb this mountain, and I'm picturing it was probably cold, it's windy, it's springtime, and they've got their coats wrapped around them, and Jesus comes to them, and Jesus says this: "Therefore go." Don't stay cozy at home. Go and make disciples, make practicing imitators of Jesus, not just people who've got the theory in their heads. Make disciples of all nations. And that's really broad, and that's the hard work of working out how the way of Jesus translates into other cultures, rather than simply getting people accidentally to just do things my way, because every culture is different. So go and make disciples of all nations. And then it says, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This is a public declaration that my old way of life is over. I have died to myself, and I have died to the gods of this village. Can you picture this in the middle of town? There's a river coming through town, or there's a pond in town. I have died to myself. I have died to the ways of this village. I've come alive with a bang to live out the way of Jesus. And then it says, are you awake now? Yeah, let that be a lesson to you. I'll do that again if you fall asleep. And then it says, teaching them to obey. So that's theory and practice. Everything I have commanded you. So they're to learn to live out the way of Jesus, to live out a different way amidst the empires of the world. And so they go, and it's hard work, and it took tears and prayer and failures along the way, but these men changed their worlds. So Jesus says, make disciples of all nations. Now this word disciple, it's an old English word, and it means a pupil or a learner, and it comes from back in the days when people didn't go to uni, but they were apprenticed. And the image is a master builder with his apprentice, or in the picture on the screen, a shoemaker with his apprentice. And the apprentice watches him closely and copies him over and over and over again. And the master will correct him. No, do it like this. Don't do it like that. And he copies him over and over again. It's the same word we get the word discipline from. And discipline means self-denial and focus, to practice, to practice, to practice. It's like learning a sporting skill or like learning a musical instrument over and over again until the student finally masters it so that it becomes second nature. That's what the word disciple meant back in their day. Now, the interesting thing is there's another side to this which I find really interesting as we talk about discipling our kids, or a bunch of fellas go away on a camp. And many of the guys going, I would imagine, would be dads or granddads or something of that sort. You see, for the Jewish people, there was an even deeper image about what discipleship meant. In Eastern cultures and in Jewish Orthodox families, the father-son relationship was particularly significant. In our cultures, it's the husband-wife relationship. In their culture, the father-son relationship was really important, and they shared this really close relationship and this really close bond. And the fathers disciple their sons. And so one of the ancient sayings was, a good father teaches his son the Torah. And even to this day, in Orthodox Jewish families, the father will teach the kids the Torah and the Hebrew. So by a really early age, they've learnt it. But it's the dad who does it. Interesting, in Aussie cultures, it's mum who's the ethical and moral guardian. In their cultures, it's dad. Teaches his son the Torah, teaches him a trade, finds him a trade, and it's often working with dad in the family business. I remember listening to Lindsay Fox talking about how his dad took him under his wing and taught him the business, the truck business that they were in. And thirdly, finds him a wife. Because in their culture, finding a partner wasn't just about hearts in the eyes. It's finding someone who shares your values and shares your rhythm of life, so that in turn you can raise the next generation to walk in these ways. And so the dad so trained and so invested his values and his ways and his traditions in the boy, so that one day when the father died, the boy would live out the father's role. It would be like he was the father. And that's what discipleship meant. And most tribal cultures understand this for both genders. And so the tribal women will take their daughters alongside them, and the men take the boys, and they totally pour their values into them. And often at the age of 13, where you're considered a young adult, you go and work with dad, and there's young blokes, there's middle-aged blokes, there's old blokes, and you are learning to rub shoulders with them and learn the ways of your village. It's interesting, we don't do that in our culture. We have, in these cultures, you don't get the idea of a teenage subculture. You don't get teenagehood. Matter of fact, teenagehood is a modern concept. Grew out of the Industrial Revolution, where people needed to spend longer in school, and it really took off post-1940s with the generation born in the 50s who were wealthy and empowered and were marketed to. And so teenagehood grew out of the 50s. And so what's happened since then is it's continued to expand. So now you've got teenagers, but you've got tweenagers, which is your 8 to 12-year-olds. And our whole society is being segmented so that we spend our entire lives with our youth group until we die. And you see it in larger churches. You have your young kids hang out here and do their thing. You have your older kids. You have your junior high kids, all with their friends and their peers and their clothes and their music and their heroes. And your senior high kids who are different to those ones. And then you have your uni age, gap year kind of young adults. And then you have your older young adults with their wealth and their money and their travel and their whatever else. And then you have your young couples, and then with their house and their mortgage and their thing, and then your young families with sleepless nights and all that good stuff happening, and your families at high school who are basically taxi services and no one's ever home because you've got music, you've got sport, and everyone's racing around being exhausted like crazy. Then you've got your empty nesters, then you've got your grey nomads travelling around grey, that's the blokes, not the girls, grey. And then you've got your then you've got your retirement village people, and then and we spend our entire lives in our youth group. And it's fascinating I remember I used to smile visiting Mum at Park Orchards. She and her mates would sit around and yak, and they talk about their music and how the music of the younger generations was useless, and how when they were young they used to. And I thought, this sounds exactly like my 16-year-old kids and their friends talking about the generation behind them. We live in our youth groups. So there's some work to be done. How do we turn it around? How do we recreate communities and households of faith that live as family and that integrate ages and genders and singles and other ethnicities? That's the work of discipleship, becoming like Jesus and starting Jesus communities. You see, our Jesus culture and faith has got to be transmitted as the stories get told and retold and acted out, and the practices are caught and internalized, and there's very little differentiation between theory and practice. And in tribal culture, all of this happens without whiteboards, without classrooms, without notebooks, without YouTube clips, without TED Talks. It's done in real life relationships as the stories are told and the practices are caught. And so when the boy gets to a certain age, he is known as the son of the father, and Jesus would have been Jesus ben Joseph. And one day when the dad passes away, the greatest compliment when the son takes over the family business was to say, "You are just like your dad." Now it's interesting that when the one we call God, the Trinity, and the first part of the Trinity and the second part of the Trinity wanted to reveal themselves in ways that we could understand, they call themselves the Father and the Son. Now, in our modern Western culture, we get into all sorts of pretty useless debates around, does that mean God is male, and does that mean women shouldn't be in ministry, and we get into all that stuff. I don't think they would have even thought like that. They would have gone, got it. We understand what the relationship, the close relationship between a father and a son is. We get what you're saying about your relationship with the other half of you, so to speak. And you see this played out as you read through the story of Jesus in the Gospels. It says he grew and was strong and was filled with wisdom. And then when he gets to the age of 13 and he has his bar mitzvah, and that's when boys get apprenticed to work with their dads. They go up to Jerusalem, they do the thing at the temple, and they're driving back home in the family wagon. And Mary goes, "Where's Jesus?" And Jesus is in the car, so they have to go back to the temple to find him. And what does Jesus say when they find him in the temple? "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business? I'm 13. I'm an apprentice now. I've got to work with Dad at the family business." And so he comes back home to Galilee with them. And then when he turns 30, which is the age when the oldest son, he comes of age, and he's recognized as an equal partner with his dad, and he now speaks for his dad and with his dad running the family business. Jesus goes down to the Jordan River where John's baptizing people, and he goes down and he gets baptized. And as he comes out of the water in his obedience to his Father, the heavens open up, and John says he sees the Spirit of God descending like a dove, like a blessing and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." There's a sense in which that's any Jewish party when the oldest son comes of age. You picture Dad picking up his champagne glass and saying, "Lift your glasses, this is my son with whom I am well pleased. And he's a partner in my business with me." That's in a sense what's going on. Another time he says, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and so too I am working." Well, what else would a son do? The son can do nothing of himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also. That's how discipleship works. And then on another occasion, it's like someone says to him, "Show us the Father." And the imagery is like the oldest boy working at the family shop, and an irate customer comes in, slams his fist on the table and says, "I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to your old man. Go and get your father." Well, what would a Jewish boy who's a partner with his dad in the family business say? "Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Hey, listen, pal, you talk to me, you talk to my dad, we talk with one mouth because we're of one mind." That's what any Jewish boy would say if he was running the family business. So this is the imagery of discipleship that Jesus bequeaths the church. And it's the idea of passing it on in relationship. And it's interesting that when the Bible talks just a little bit about elders and deacons, it's all about character and lifestyle and household. And it says almost zero about constitutional roles. I've done over the years a lot of church consultancy, and every church thinks its model of governance is the right one. This is almost nothing. There's nothing about church strategies and programs. It's all about relationship and character. So, for example, 1 Timothy 3, here's a trustworthy saying: anyone who sets his heart on being an overseer desires a noble task. Now, the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, so you're talking about fidelity, you're talking about self-control, must be respectable, hospitable, able to teach. In that culture, that would have meant storytelling and modelling. Not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, and so on it goes. And it's interesting that one of the qualities of eldership is hospitality. The word is xenophilia. It means a lover of strangers. You see, it's people are drawn into your home and watch how you live out your Christian faith as a purported leader within the church community, and how you treat your kids and how you treat your spouse and how you use your money and how you speak when no one's watching. That's where the way of Jesus gets seen. And that's where the stranger is going to say, so tell me more about this faith of yours. We used to, when it was a stage of my life, when our kids were quite little, where we had a lot of people who were wanting to get married. And we got into the habit of inviting the young engaged couples round for tea to talk about weddings. And we'd always invite them round on a weeknight. And we never used the good cutlery and the good crockery on the good table in the other room. We'd always have leftovers around the kitchen table with the kids like we normally did. And they'd come and sit there, and the kids would be arcing up, and this one spitting peas on the ground, and this one is getting toilet trained, so he's gone off to the toilet and wants to come back and show everyone how well he's done, and this one's, and we'd go around the table doing what we normally do, and we had a habit of what was one good thing that happened every day, and how can we pray for you today, and how can we bless you today, and we tell a Bible story. The kids would then have a go at sharing and telling the Bible story. And you'd watch, it always used to blow me away as how many Christian kids from Christian families getting married are sitting there, and this business of doing a meal together and talking about life and God together was so new for them. You think, my goodness, you're spending thousands of dollars on rings and parties and weddings and all the rest of it, but you've never seen the basics of how you live it out. Does that make sense to you? We got work to do as parents and grandparents in creating spaces where this gets modelled, where this gets drawn out. It's about character and attitudes and habits, not just accumulating theory. It's about slow-cooked learning, not fast food learning. Paul says to Timothy, as for you, continue in what you have learnt and become convinced of, because you know those. That means you have a relationship with those from whom you learnt it. And how from infancy, babyhood, you have known the Holy Scriptures which were able to make you wise for salvation. It's about catching it in relationship. Most of you would know that back last millennium, I was youth pastor here for 8 or 9 years. And we had a fantastic youth ministry. It was a really big, really thriving, growing, awesome youth ministry. And occasionally over the years, I will catch up with people who were kids in that youth ministry who look really old now. I'm not sure what that means, but who've grown up in it, and we'll get to reminiscing. I caught up with someone just recently. And, oh, yeah, those were great days. It was fantastic. And I was preparing myself to look humble. Waiting for them to say, you did such a good job with your youth leaders running that program. But they didn't. They said, oh, the thing that sticks with me, and they quoted word for word, going round to Gordon and Elizabeth Wood's place. And I remember Elizabeth said this, and then Gordon said this, and I was watching what they were doing with their kids. 40 years on, they're remembering this stuff. Or people talk about the McDonalds or the Jacksons or the Lewises. I'm sure there's many other families. The stuff that's sunk in, they've remembered, or the Hugenrads with the group of young adults that used to hang at their place. That's the stuff they remember hanging out with older people in real life families. Not that the youth group stuff was wrong or bad, that's good too. But we need to rethink this. Why do we abdicate the discipleship of our kids and think that 40 minutes on a Sunday morning or youth group for an hour on a Friday night with a bunch of young adults who are doing a great job, why do we think that's going to cut it when it hasn't worked for the last 50 years? Is that harsh? Well, the stats say it's harsh because the numbers are like this. We got some work to do. And it's an exciting thing to talk about. How do we reshape this so we become family? But it begins with this. This whole discipleship business begins with this. And I want to finish with this. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if you want to be my followers, if you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way and take up your cross and follow me. You see, I'm picturing Jesus and his mates sitting by the side of the road, and I'm picturing Jesus pointing up the road, and maybe there are some Roman soldiers leading away a condemned prisoner, and behind the prisoner are the weeping women and the other people wailing and watching. And on the back of the prisoner is a rough wooden cross. He's alive, but he's dead. All of his own dreams are now gone. And all of his possessions are no longer his. And all of his relationships have, in effect, ended. And he's lost all control over his own destiny. He is totally at the beck and call of the Roman officer who's leading the way. He's alive, but he's dead to himself and his own life because he's carrying his own cross to a place where he will be crucified and it will end. And so Jesus uses this vivid language. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way and take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your own life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life, for my sake, you will save it. What do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? And that's where the journey of discipleship begins. It begins with saying, Jesus, you and you alone are my Lord. Let's pray. Oh Lord, and if you want, you can pray these words with me. Lord, my old life, I want to say to you that you are my Lord and my old life is over. And I choose to live for you. You come and you take your place in the throne room of my life. And you show me day by day how to live. Take these eyes and see through them. Take these ears and let me hear the cry of the hurting and wounded world around me. And take this mouth to speak your words. And take this heart to show your love. And take this mind to think your thoughts. And take these possessions, this money, they're yours, just on loan to me. And take these feet to walk me to the places and the people where I can best represent you. And take these hands to serve in your name. Let thy will be done in me as it is in heaven. For thine is the glory forever and forever and forever. Amen.